Please continue to share. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Crymans. I'm an extension educator with the University of Minnesota Extension, and I'm so pleased to have you all with us today for the webinar, Rural Housing, Making It Happen. If you haven't had an opportunity already, go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, share where you're from, and if you consider yourself to be urban or rural. Today we have two presenters who are going to be sharing about rural housing. Ryan Pesch, who's an extension educator in community economics with the U of M, and Diane Larson with the Itasca County HRA, where she serves as director. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves briefly, and then I'll have a few more slides before I hand it over to Ryan. But Ryan, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Welcome, everybody. Good to have you here. My name is Ryan Pesch. I'm hailing from Lyda Township in northern Otter Tail County, just east of Pelican Rapids, to kind of place myself geographically. I'm an extension educator. I work in community economic development throughout West Central Minnesota and statewide. And so we work with a lot of issues that relate to economic development and communities. And for me, almost exclusively in rural communities. And so I don't necessarily consider myself a great housing expert per se. That Diane is, but I certainly am somebody that's steeped in working with communities and community economic development and business development. And certainly, without a doubt, we've gotten a bit into some housing issues in part because it's such a big issue for both rural communities generally and their business communities specifically.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Diane, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Diane Larson, and I'm the Executive Director at the Itasca County HRA. I've lived in northern Minnesota my whole life, always rural, having grown up in Bemidji, and then spent my entire career here in Itasca County in Grand Rapids. I've actually been with the HRA for over 30 years. I'm not going to tell you how many over, but I started when I was really young. And so my entire career has been spent in housing as part of the staff of the Housing Authority. You're going to hear more about our work as we go. So I'm just going to turn it back to you, Sarah.
Great. Thank you, Diane. I also wanted to take just a moment to introduce Rick Meyer, who is our webinar producer today. And so if you have any tech issues, you can private chat Rick and he'll help you with that. Rick's also going to be helping us with some polls in just a minute, as well as helping to monitor the chat box. But if you need anything, reach out to Rick. And thanks, Rick, again for being with us today. So we're going to pull up a poll, and there's three parts to it. So we're interested in why are you participating? How would you rate your housing development knowledge? And are you familiar with the services that your local HRA offers? So go ahead and respond to those. There's a slide bar on the side, so you can scroll down so you see all three of those questions. And we'll give folks just a minute to respond to those, and then we'll share those results. All right, we'll go for just another 15 seconds here. We're getting close. Wow, we've got 45 out of 50 responding. Rick, let's go ahead and share those results and see where we're at.
Looks like about half are here for personal only and others professional, and both.
Okay.
And the knowledge, about 78% rating themselves basic. And with their knowledge of their local HRA, 67% said not at all, knowing what services are provided.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, everyone, for responding to those. That just really helps us helps us identify who's on the call and where folks are sitting. So thank you for doing that. I am now going to hand it over to Ryan, who's going to get us started.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sarah. So I'm just going to kind of frame up housing development and give a little bit of some sense of some of these case studies that we had done a few years ago about how different rural communities are approaching housing development in their community. Oop, don't go too fast, Ryan. So a quick little framing, like I said, I come from the world of community development and community economic development. And so just think about kind of where housing fits in terms of, sorry, a vital community, if you will. Oftentimes in community development, we like to use this framing around the community capitals. And so you see over here on the right, natural capital, cultural capital, human capital. A lot of times, and say, for a lot of people's work, especially for those of us that are in education with the university and such, we're doing a lot of work in human capital. How do we train people up, skill people up? That's kind of part of what we're doing here. You supposedly will have more human capital having gone through this webinar with myself and Diane, and you're just gonna be smarter and more skilled and more able to do things. Great. But some of the harder ones, oftentimes to move, or it takes a bit of effort to move, around built capital, financial capital. When we think about housing, if we think about a kind of say a multifamily housing development, you know, a community really wants to house all these people that work in their community, or the community is not growing, so they know they need a bigger development of housing. It really takes effort, boom, to move that built capital arena, and that takes financial capital, that takes lending, that might take private funds, it might take public funds. More than likely, as we'll see in some of these case studies, and I'm surely Diane will talk a little bit about it, a lot of housing is a lot of alphabet soup about a lot of different funds coming together in order to make a project happen. And so this is kind of how I think about it, and a lot of people in community development think about, how do we improve the community overall? We might think about these different parts of capital that need to be grown or expanded in order to make something happen. And for us, we ran into this a lot, and we've say in the last 10 years, we've done a lot of work around welcoming communities. How do we welcome newcomers to communities? In large part because a lot of communities are often hamstrung from growing, in part because they may not just have the households or the workers there to grow. And so there's a lot of effort in economic and community development lately in terms of recruiting and retaining people. It's more of a people play strategy than a business play strategy. And the thing that we butt up against again and again and again is it's housing, right? So how do we get our hands around it? How do we understand it? And how do we move this stone? Because it seems like a pretty big stone to move. It isn't just the community. There's a lot of other factors at play that are very macro, that are at the national level and at the state level. And here at the community level, you can only do so much when it comes to financial capital and built capital. And so in extension, we've done a little bit of work around doing some housing studies to help communities get a better sense about these issues. But a few years ago, we did do some case studies because it was enough of an issue just to say, how are different communities approaching this? What are the strategies communities are employing? So here's this link that if you did want to read these case studies afterwards or peruse them as we're going through the webinar, z.umn.edu/rural housing. Try to keep it simple. And you should find this page here. And essentially what we did in this project is to interview folks like Diane, other folks that are involved in the EDA, communities that are maybe taking a creative approach to dealing with their housing issues and raising the issue in their community and the like. And when you look at this, there's a broad mix in terms of how communities do this and the actors that are involved in making this happen. But we tried to sort of suss out some of the major things. The first two I think kind of go together. One, it's about knowing your resources, and collaboration is critical, right? there's often multiple players in a community that need to come together to make a housing project happen, right? And oftentimes, I'm not talking about one single family housing house that was built, that's like between one person and their bank often. But we're talking about multifamily housing, or maybe a development that's a new development in a community that is single family housing. Oftentimes it's multiple players in the community working, but also working with outside resources. So a lot of, especially multifamily housing and affordable housing and workforce housing is really not done without federal tax credits, without state programs and support. So it gets kind of complicated. As I said, the alphabet soup of housing development, which I'm not as smart on as Diane, right? So that alphabet soup, it kind of takes a professional to navigate those, program A, B, C, D, and a whole bunch of variations and how they're all changing over time. A few other things: community conversations lead to better decisions. It is like a lot of community development where we need to get people agreeing on what are the priorities and how do we move it forward in our community. And that takes conversation, that takes organization. Momentum matters. So I'll just show a few examples here about how communities that have rural communities and how they've dealt with some housing. One is Balaton, Southwest Minnesota, near Marshall. This is it's a growing community now. You can kind of think it's a growing bedroom community. My neck of the woods is like a Barnesville compared to a Fargo-Moorhead. And this is really an EDA-led effort in order to recruit folks as well as develop housing in the community. And so you see this little brochure they did. Some of it's like community positioning, right? Hey, you can see they did some marketing to their whole community around housing and people recruitment, a great place to call home. They did 3-year tax abatement. So again, it's tax abatement. Some of these things like that are very, very common that an EDA would engage in to say, how can we spur more housing development in our community? Well, we seem to have an opportunity in relation to where we are to Marshall. Maybe a tax abatement is good. They also put up a spec house as the EDA in order to kind of prod some development. Again, that's EDA led. Right down the road from me here in Otter Tail County is Perham, Minnesota, community that's here like 2,900 people. So not a very large community, but also a community that has a pretty wide commuter workforce shed. There's a fair amount of industry in a Perham and a very kind of active business community, if you will. So they're very much in the place where it's like, we need, to them, they frame it as really workforce housing. We are right now pulling people from 80 miles away and trying to recruit them to our community. And lo and behold, there's really no place for them to live or rent for that matter. So we keep going further and further out, even though our businesses continue to grow and have a greater need for more and more people. And so this, I think, is a great example recently of a privately led, it isn't completely privately funded, but definitely a privately led private organization that really took the lead outside, separate from their EDA, to say, like, we're putting money into this. They got the major employers together that created their own kind of working group, kind of private-public partnership. They put money in, they put some incentives together, and then worked with that alphabet soup of public housing programs in order to begin putting in a fairly sizable amount of multifamily housing in the community. I think at this point they're on their 8th development in a relatively short period of time. That guy there, that's Chuck Johnson. He's now the retired EDA director. You're like, who's that guy? So I just 2 more. One is Ortonville. Ortonville's, we call it on the bump. The bump on the west side of Minnesota. They've actually done some marketing around that, like Visit the Bump or MN Bump. It's kind of their promotional stuff nowadays. For them, their EDA really, considering it's a smaller community, I know it's under 3,000. They were really looking to do some more intentional filtering of housing from seniors to new families and such. So they took on 2 roles. One was this development of senior housing, which actually opened up a lot of housing within their community that then could be purchased. And then they also went through the same, Diane, your the housing partnership
Institute?
the institute, there we go. And you're going to talk about that. They went through that as a team. So a whole team of the community came together to identify funding streams and opportunities for workforce housing in the community after doing this senior housing project.
Well, and Ryan, if I can jump into, we have a colleague, Ben Winchester, who has kind of a mantra, and he's done programming related to seniors on moving in, moving out, moving over. And so interesting that Ortonville was working to help those seniors move over, right, to make space for young families.
Yes. Yep. And that's an intentional process on their part. You know, I mean, and it's an older community. If I in the case study, I just have a simple cohort analysis, and you can just see compared to the state of Minnesota, yeah, it's an older community. It makes a lot of sense for them to do that in terms of growing their community by growing senior housing. And lastly, this is just an example, I think, of a community engagement process around housing that happened in Milan. Now, Milan, I know, is less than 1,000 people. I don't know, it's 800 people or something like this, and near Montevideo. And in this example, there were a group of artists that created this, what they called a listening house, right? And so they took a vacant property in the community. So this is a community that's small. There's a fair amount of vacant commercial and sort of dilapidated housing. And I know that within this whole region, there's a lot of conversation around redevelopment. How do we sort of improve the quality of housing stock here and get new development or redevelop the existing housing stock in this region? For them, what they did is, there you go, 364. Thank you, Sarah. And so what they did is this listening house. So they took a vacant property. They set up basically an art exhibition and had a whole bunch of open houses, and people could go in and they basically engage with this question about, what does housing mean to you? What does housing mean here? How do we improve housing in this region? And through that kind of process, they were getting kind of interesting feedback and input in terms of insights like, where should we go with housing next? So it's a little more of an engagement process, and it is really a development process, but one that I thought was creative to kind of get the community overall thinking about, you know, what do we do? Because like I said, part of it is having a better conversation about housing to kind of intentionally move forward to how to develop new housing in a community, or redevelopment housing. So okay, that's me. All right, enough of that. So I'm gonna turn it over to Diane. So again, you're 30 years in the HRA. She knows more than I do on this housing thing. So off to you, Diane.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks, Ryan. It's studies like yours and putting out information about what communities are doing that help raise awareness of housing and really help to help communities find out what other communities are doing to address the problem. So thank you. A very interesting read. Today, I am going to do 3 things, hopefully for you. I'm going to talk a little bit about Itasca County HRA and what we do and where we're located. In our poll, I learned that many of you are not real familiar with an HRA, and much of what we do will be done by HRAs across the state of Minnesota. So I think that will be interesting for you, but that will be very brief. The real purpose of my presentation today will be to take a little bit of a deeper dive into a development that we did here in the city of Grand Rapids called Beacon Hill back in 2016. And then I'm going to kind of show you what's come out of that and what's come out of that work. And then at the very end, I have a few key takeaways of my own about what I think it takes to do it rurally, and maybe some suggestions for you of where you might want to get started. Minnesota is home to about 154 housing and redevelopment authorities. So there's most likely one that covers your jurisdiction or your community. When I talk about the Itasca County HRA and our work, I like to put it into these 4 distinct buckets. And at the top here is Rental Assistance Administrator. We unlike or like many other housing authorities, administer federal and state rent assistance dollars that provides rental assistance to families who are out in your community renting from a private landlord. We actually provide rent assistance to about 350 families every month here in Itasca County, and that does bring about $1.9 million into Itasca County just in direct rental assistance. At the bottom of the screen, we are also a landlord, an owner and manager of rental property. We actually own and manage about 10 properties throughout Itasca County, and that includes about 400 rental units. I will back up a minute and say that an HRA's mission is typically in that affordable realm. So we're providing affordable workforce housing in our communities. And over on the left, I've got developer, redeveloper. Not all housing authorities do development or rehab programs. We have delved into that. We've done some development of multifamily. We've also partnered with the city of Grand Rapids to do some rehab programs for single family homes, commercial properties, and rent properties that are owned by private landlords. And way over on the right, I always want to mention, and I think Ryan alluded to this in his comments, partnering. Many of our programs, many of our developments have multiple partners. We have come to realize that if we want to make an impact on housing in our communities, we have to partner. And it really has worked out well for you. And I'll illustrate that in our Beacon Hill case study. So where is Itasca County? A lot of times when I say I work for Itasca County HRA, everyone thinks I work by the headwaters of the Mississippi River. That's not accurate. Itasca County, for anyone who might not know, is in northeastern Minnesota. We are right on the edge of the Iron Range. We're a large geographical county, as you can see here, about 3,000 square miles. Our county seat is Grand Rapids. So how did we get started? What did we know? I'm guessing if you're on this webinar today, you're thinking you might have a housing need. You're seeing a housing need throughout the state. What's being done about it? How can we influence? Well, when we first started, we knew from the work we did at the HRA, from our partners, from everything we were hearing in our communities, that there was this need for housing. So that was a real general walk around knowledge. We knew it, but how did we quantify it? How did we really find out if we had a need for housing? Were we right? We actually, through our process, commissioned a third party housing needs analysis. And that needs analysis justified or documented that we were correct. We had a really, really tight rental market. This was back in 2014, we had this study done. Over half, or 53% of just the renters in Grand Rapids were cost burdened. And what I mean by that is you're a family that pays more than 30% of your income towards your rent costs each month. And the study showed that just in the core Grand Rapids area, not including the entire county, we had a demand for an additional 500 housing units. I would add here that I believe, and what you might be seeing in your communities, is that since COVID, this has been exacerbated. These numbers would be even more today, and we are continuing to monitor those numbers. So how did we get started? We knew we had a housing needs. What were we going to do about it? Ryan mentioned the Housing Institute. What we did is in early 2013, we decided to invite anybody and everybody in our community that might have a desire to be a part of our housing solution. So it was not only housing providers, it was people from other organizations that might be working with clients who needed housing. It ran the gamut. We ended up to have a meeting with about 35 to 40 people. And we presented this idea of making an application to the Minnesota Housing Partnership to form a Housing Institute team. And out of that, we did make application and we were accepted. And we had a team of 7 folks that actually participated in a year-long process to learn about housing, to really decide to take action in our community. So the real purpose of the Housing Institute is to build capacity in a community, to really help that community, and it's almost always typically rural, to create and preserve affordable housing in your community. So we, like I said, participated in this 12-month program. We were required to attend 4 overnight workshops, training, and they provided us with technical assistance. Here's a picture back in about probably 2014 of our initial team. We had some others that followed along with us, but this was actually the team that traveled to these core trainings. We have 2 people here from the HRA is all, but we also have 2 people from Northland Counseling Center. We have someone here from the Minnesota Department of Corrections. We have someone from Grace House, which is our local housing homeless shelter. And we have someone from Kutaska, which is our community action agency, if you're familiar with that in your community. So our experience throughout the Housing Institute really ended up being key for us. We learned a lot. Even as a housing provider, it allowed us to bring other people in our community along with us in their knowledge of housing. So we had guest speakers, and we were allowed to invite key people from our community to come and hear some of these guest speakers. So in this picture, in the right-hand corner, upper right-hand corner, is the mayor of Grand Rapids at the time. And we knew we were going to need political will in order to get a project done. And we invited him to come to one of the key presentations. And he came with us for a whole afternoon to learn about housing. And that turned out to be one of the best things that we ever did. We had roundtables with developers. We called it a speed dating day. And we got to pitch what our idea was to different developers and ask them if it had ever been done. Was it doable? You know, just all kinds of questions that we might want to have answered. We had funder presentations where we learned about different types of funding and what kinds of projects they would fund. On our own, our team took tours of different housing projects throughout the state that we thought would be similar to what we wanted to do. Ultimately, our job throughout this institute was to set a goal that was achievable and that we were going to continue to work on after that initial 12 months. And we decided to go big or go home, and we decided we wanted to work together to actually develop a multifamily housing complex that included some supportive housing for those that needed some assistance in our community. So because of the Housing Institute, we were able to get technical assistance from Minnesota Housing Partnership, and they helped us to decide what our next steps were. So we started to investigate sites in our community. Where could this be done? Where was it properly zoned? All of those kinds of things. We engaged a developer. We actually did a request for proposals for a developer. And we even went to the next step of interviewing some developers to decide who we really wanted to work with, who we felt could best help us with what we wanted to do in our community. Once we had that developer engaged, he was able to help us assemble the financing package and application to the state for financing through Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. I'll talk about the timeline in a minute, you know, how long did this take, but basically out of that, Beacon Hill was born. Beacon Hill is a 48-unit multifamily housing project, and I'll show you a picture in a minute, but on the property, we've got both an apartment style building and some townhomes on the property. You can see here what our initial rents were. So back in when we opened in late 2016, these were the initial rents, very affordable in our community. The HRA brought some rent assistance to the table. So there's some units at the property that do receive some rent assistance that allows us to target even some lower income families. We did develop a community center here, trying to really integrate community into this project, a playground for the children. And our total development cost at that time was right around $9.4 million to do this project. Beacon Hill is unique in that it serves a wide variety of populations, and that was intentional for us. In the apartment building, we are serving basically 2 types of supportive housing populations, one that has some higher needs, and in the other wing, those that just have some lower needs in order to be successful renters. That's our goal here, is helping people to be successful renters in our community. And then the townhomes were designed for workforce housing. Those working in our community, the LPNs, the beginning teachers, the police officers, those that in our community could not necessarily afford the typical market rate rent or to purchase a home in our community. And those are 2 and 3 bedroom units, primarily designed for families. And it really turned out to be a unique project. When you talk about the complexity of housing, it takes time. It takes time to do housing. As I stated here, way over on the left, we had that initial meeting of our stakeholders back in 2013. As you can see here, we participated in that Housing Institute training between April of 2013 and 14. So that was a year-long process, but we were working on this through then. And you can see by June 2nd here, we had an option on a property, and then things really started to move for us. We were able to assemble our application to Minnesota Housing Finance Agency by June 10th of that same year. And we were awarded funding in our first go-round, October of 2014. And I want to pause here because that could be an unusual expectation. It oftentimes takes 2 or 3 rounds of application in order to get funded. If we wouldn't have gotten funded in October of 2014, we would have needed to wait till the following year in 2015 and tweaked our application. What could we improve on it, and gone back in for funding. We were fortunate that we were funded in that first ask. So we started construction in September of 2015, and by August of 2016, about a year later, we were starting to lease up units. This slide is super busy. It's way too busy for a PowerPoint presentation. I know that. I'm not going to read through it with you. I only put it up here to illustrate that housing development in rural Minnesota, or anywhere, quite frankly, requires multiple funding sources. It's complex, but it is definitely doable. If we can do it here, there's lots of other communities that are doing it. It's doable in many rural communities. So now I'm going to show you a few fun pictures. This is our grand opening celebration event. Over on the left-hand side, hopefully you still recognize us after we went through this process, but there's some of our Housing Institute partners. There's some funders here, our developers here, and just some really key people, but it took this many people and organizations. These people were all key to the development of Beacon Hill. And in the background there, you can see we're taking this picture in front of our community center. So we went from this was the piece of property. It was actually a tax forfeit piece of property. It's about 8 acres in size, to this. So this is what Beacon Hill ended up to look like. As you can see here up in the right-hand upper corner of this picture is the apartment building, which is all supportive housing units, 20 supportive housing units. In the middle, we developed or constructed some offices for supportive housing staff. And behind it is a large community room and a kitchen. And then around this ring road are the townhome units, all 2 and 3 bedroom units with attached garages and a playground in the center. And then here's that community center building here on the right-hand side that we took that picture in front of. So some key takeaways, I guess, from our experience, and then to show you what we've done since then, is there's housing challenges throughout our state. First, there's a mismatch between supply and demand. Definitely the demand, not only here in Itasca County, but throughout the state, and I'm sure in many of your communities, exceeds the supply of housing. And as I stated earlier, that has just gotten worse as we've gone through the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic. We have rising costs, not only on the construction side, but even after you get something developed on the operating side. So your pro forma, making your project cash flow, isn't as easy as it used to be either. And again, we're seeing that has worsened again, as you all know, supply chain issues, rising costs of lumber, everything. It's just, that's a challenge, and it's a challenge to develop affordable housing. Another challenge is that there's lots of needs. So in our community, You know, we probably have a need for multifamily housing, single family housing, senior housing, housing with assisted living for seniors, townhouses. There's a lot of competing interests. In a healthy housing market, you want all of those available, but you really have to narrow it down. And what are we going to start with, and what can we tackle as an organization? Also, there's developer community capacity issues. Housing is complex, and you do have to develop that capacity or have that capacity in your community. Finally, limited resources. There's certainly resources through the state, but it typically takes multiple sources, and those sources are highly sought after. So I've done a lot of talking. I'm going to open it up here for a little audience participation. I'm really interested in hearing from you of what additional challenges your community might be facing. In the previous slide, I listed some that we here in Itasca County see on a consistent basis. But if you would use your chat, and if you know of challenges in your community, please share those here with the group. And I'm just going to open it up for that chat. And I think Sarah here will give it a couple of minutes for people to think about that.
Yeah, definitely. We'll give folks a moment to find their chat box and collect their thoughts. So Maxine is sharing that it's really difficult for single people to find affordable housing without having a roommate. Sharon's talking about the price of rent within the area for single folks. Ryan, high-end lake properties taking out existing more affordable housing. Zach is sharing, my community is potentially hundreds of buildable lots, but seems to lack builders and developers.
Those are all great comments, and we're seeing that absolutely here too. Builders and developers here in Itasca County are so busy, but we're finding that they're typically building that higher end housing, that single family housing that might be on the lake or might be on a single piece of property. We're not seeing a lot of subdivision development or multifamily housing development.
Yeah. And I'd back that up. We had done some focus groups in Pope County, which is where like Glenwood, Minnesota is. It's in that Lakes Country, Western Lakes Country. And that's something we had some builders in that focus group. And that was very much a case. They're like, why you guys are talking about building these simpler houses? They just have a smaller margin. And they're like, well, we can make as much on, one more expensive, say, executive home than we can on 5 of these sort of run-of-the-mill, maybe more basic homes that, yeah, we could probably make, but there's this trade-off, right? So we have these, and so how do you incentivize a stressed kind of building industry in order to go this direction and not the direction they're currently told to go? It's a tough one.
I would add to that, Ryan, and there's some of the comments are reflecting this, is that in terms of single family housing development, if you can find a developer who can go to an urban community and develop 100 homes and get economies of scale, like I drive through Lakeville and you see all of this home development going on. We've reached out to some of those developers, but they're not going to come to rural Minnesota, to Itasca County, when the market's probably only going to allow them to maybe do 10 homes or 20 homes maybe. Right. They just don't get those economies of scale. So that is difficult. And, there's some comments here about single persons affording rent or to get into home ownership. And I've talked to some younger folks, and, these are folks that are out working, they've got a decent job, but boy, when they go to look at renting just by themselves or to get into home ownership, to do it on one income is very difficult. Yeah, and Brian, you're right. The housing value to construction cost gap, that's really been exacerbated. So that's absolutely true.
I like Brenda's comment as well about, the current housing stock is not built for individuals to age in place, but again, that lack of options. So interesting to think about what Ortonville was doing to help some of those seniors move over and have some options.
Well, that probably is going to be the larger trend if I put my demographer hat on, Ben talked about this in that last webinar we had done. If you just look at demography, who currently owns our current housing stock, a very large percentage, greater than in urban areas, in rural areas, is held by boomers who are looking to transition. And so this question becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. It's buttressed by a fact I just heard in the news, but I won't try the numbers, but they looked at millennials equity, right? If you put your banker hat on, the amount of equity held by millennials is significantly less than the baby boom generation at a comparable time. So if you look at, say, the 70s and what amount of equity the baby boom generation had, it just was big, in large part because they had transitioned into housing, or there was housing built and they had taken on those mortgages, and there they were building equity in these homes. And millennials are like, we're stuck here. And so this transition of a very large generation transitioning out of their homes as a bigger generation is now trying to get into homes is a very, very, very large demographic shift that's going to shift wealth and homes and a whole bunch of things. So it's almost like a stay tuned thing. And so I think for communities to bring it home is like that strategy of an Ortonville or any community of like, how do we filter housing to new residents as our seniors who are maybe having a difficult time aging in place, how we what can we do to support our seniors while at the same time filtering housing to new residents and a new generation is a very big question.
When I think you spoke of the millennials, Ryan, and I think about, the increased student loan debts and all of those other obligations that generation has too, that makes it challenging to make housing affordable for them. Brian talks about zoning.
But certainly, I would say, Brian, hey, that gets to this issue about having conversation, identifying issues, and organizing as a community. Zoning is done by us and the folks that we are electing, and we just need more responsive leaders. Zoning changes. I've been to many a planning meeting. I'm sure Diane's been to many a planning meeting as well. Local leaders can change zoning. If it's an issue, change it. Not saying everybody's going to like the change, but it has to be started as a conversation. Yep.
That's absolutely
zoning, Diane. You might dealt with these.
What?
Zoning issues.
Absolutely. Actually, I will confess that when we went to try to develop Beacon Hill, I didn't want to have to address that because I wanted to do an affordable housing project. I knew I was going to have some naysayers no matter what. I didn't want to be in front of the Planning Commission requesting a zoning change. And so I was looking for property that was properly zoned, that I could do a multifamily development. But you're exactly right. Those are the things, as being like it's being mentioned in the chat, that can be prohibitive and challenging for developing housing. And we need to address those things in our communities with the political leaders. That's definitely true. And I see somebody's mentioned here, wages have far outpaced housing costs, or have been far outpaced by housing costs. And that's interesting because that's actually in my next slide. So I think I'm going to just thank you all for participating in that chat. All great comments. I'm just going to move us to the next slide here. And one of the things, and I've got here is, why is housing, and I call it unaffordable, and some of the chat alluded to that, but here in Itasca County, we've got a growing population. And that's not true throughout the entire state, but it is in a lot of areas. And we need workers. We've got industry coming in. We've got workers coming into our community. We've got this pent up demand already. And I'm having city leaders and others, you know, having conversations with me saying, where are all these workers going to live? We need housing for these workers. And throughout the state of Minnesota, we need 300,000 more homes at this particular point in time. So definitely there's pent up demand throughout the state. We've also got rising costs. And as I stated before, that's not only construction costs right now with the cost of lumber and the supply chain issues and the cost of land, but it's those operating costs, the insurance, the everything when you go to actually open up your building, your multifamily building and try to make it cash flow, you've just got increasing costs, which means what? Increasing rents. And so it really makes it hard to make housing, develop it and have it be affordable to our general workforce. And what was said in the chat was there's this mismatch of income versus housing costs. Definitely housing costs have risen at a much higher pace than incomes in the typical community in Minnesota. So again, I'm going to open it up here for a really quick little conversation with our audience. So are there other things in your community that you think is making housing unaffordable? So think about that and respond in the chat again, if you would, please. And I would just say someone had mentioned zoning, and that definitely contributes to whether housing is affordable or not. So do folks have thoughts on, in your community, what else makes it unaffordable? In addition to some of the things that we're facing here.
While we're waiting for folks to add to the chat and about the affordability or unaffordability, we did a book read recently, and I got it up on my shelf. I'll find it in a minute. But one of the things that they talked about were ADUs, the accessory dwelling units. So putting a mother-in-law seat in the back.
Funny thing, maybe you'll laugh at this. I came down because I grew up in Iowa, but not southern, well, kind of southern, but not on the Missouri border. My mom grew up kind of near the Missouri border. But something funny, I went down for an interview in Kansas City and a job interview right out of college for a teaching job. And they were all talking and I kept hearing them say KCK, KCMO.
Jen, maybe you could put a little bit more in the chat about your comments there. So I was sharing, we did a book read and it was on Brave New Home by Diana Lind, and they talked about those ADUs, the accessory dwelling units. So putting a mother-in-law home in your backyard, or the tiny homes, and zoning issues with that as well. So being creative with other types of housing was interesting to think about.
What is in the chat? One of our friends was mentioning about prefab housing and asking about where this fits into the puzzle. In similar to what you're talking about there, Sarah.
Gentrification, Cassie mentioned as well.
It's also being mentioned the ability to, since COVID, many people have the ability to live in places maybe where they couldn't live before with their jobs. And I think that's really impacting rural Minnesota from my perspective. What we see here is a lot of folks that want to come up north and live, or want to come back home and live where they grew up. And now they're being able to do that. But what that is impacting is, again, our housing supply. There still has to be a place for them to live that's affordable.
Craig comments about water and sewer. I was so excited when rural water came by our acreage several years ago, and we tapped in, but it wasn't cheap. Our county also got a beautiful grant for high-speed internet. So having cable optic coming into my rural home is a great advantage as well, but those options may not be available everywhere.
Mhm. Well, and there's another comment here from Sonia about ensuring quality for affordable housing. And I think that's very true. I think what we don't want to do in our communities is, because it's become so difficult to try to develop housing and make it affordable, we don't want to compromise quality, because that also alludes to the long-term viability of housing. And so I think those are really important for us to think about. Thank you all for sharing. Appreciate it. It's good to hear from others around the state to see if what we're seeing here is compatible with what you're seeing. And I'm just going to leave you in the essence of time here. I'm going to move on, and just a few things. What worked for us, and I'm not saying this is going to work in every community, but it really helped when we stopped working in silos. The Housing Authority, we used to do our Housing Authority business. Northland Counseling Center did their business. Pawhuska did their business. We've stopped doing that. So we've identified key partners, and we have continued to work together since Beacon Hill. Those lines of communication are open. We've really developed some trust relationships here in our community. We feel like we've worked with the right developer. We know it takes a long time, and you have to be patient when you do housing. And I'm going to end with a new development. This picture isn't the greatest, but it's the picture I had available to me right now. You can see there's still a piece of sheetrock laying out here because it's new. This is our newest project. It's called Aurora Heights, and we used many of the same partners, the same developer, and we just did a new project. It just opened in December of 2021. This project has 1, 2, 3, and 4 bedroom units and is home to 56 families. It again includes this apartment building, and then there's some townhomes off to the side and behind it that house families. So again, we were able to replicate what we did with Beacon Hill just by developing those relationships, developing that expertise in our community. And so that approach has worked for us. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Diane and Ryan. You have both given us so much to think about, and we encourage folks to continue to put chats and comments in the chat where we're seeing those come through, and that's so valuable. I'm going to do just a few housekeeping things, and then we can address any final questions at the end. If you need a certificate of participation, we have that available. You will simply need to complete the evaluation, and I've got a link on the next slide. And we will also share that in a follow-up email along with a PDF of the PowerPoint slides. If you are a University of Minnesota employee and you use their insurance, yes, you can get well-being points, and you can access those by completing the evaluation as well. And so we encourage everyone to complete the evaluation, provide us with some feedback. What did you think? What would you like to see more of, less of? What other topics? That type of thing. So again, we'll be including this link in the chat. I think, Rick, if we're able to put that in there, and we'll be doing it and sharing it in a follow-up email. Also, just an FYI, we'll be doing a follow-up email in approximately 30 days at the end of the series. And I think this is the last webinar in our housing or no place like home series. In that will be just, again, a quick eval, asking how you've used information and resources. And then we'll also include a playlist of all of the recorded webinars in this series. We encourage you to participate in future webinars by the University of Minnesota Extension Center for Family Development. Here is our general link where you can access all of our webinars, events, courses from the University of Minnesota. And we're currently in the process of finalizing plans for our September through December webinars. So having registered for this webinar, you're added onto our list, and you'll get an email with information once those are decided. And then again, we just invite folks to engage with us, social media, At the bottom, there's a family news e-newsletter. We encourage you to subscribe there, and you'll get, I think it's like monthly newsletter with information from our Center for Family Development. So I think that was my last slide. So if there are any final comments or chats, definitely share those. Ryan and Diane, if you have anything else you would like to share as well. This has been a
Sarah?
great discussion.
Sarah, I'll add one thing. I think they should fill out the evaluation after you send out the email. Currently, it's not active.
Oh, okay. I will double check on that. Thank you, Rick.
So we'll
Okay.
provide the link in the follow-up
In the
email
follow-up
to
email.
everyone.
Thanks for checking that, Rick. And-
My final word, I guess, is saying, you can see just from our own chat where we've gone with this thing. Like Diane said, there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of actors involved in terms of making development happen, and it takes time over time. As community development person, I like to say sometimes we might admire these things as problems, but I entreat any of you to think of yourself not as a casual observer of these things, but as a citizen of your community. There are organizations, like 76% didn't know what their HRA was. Well, Diane's a real human being. There is probably an HRA in your jurisdiction. There is a place to start by connecting with those local resources that already exist. And if there are issues in your community around housing, what it takes, I've done this long enough, it takes local leaders and it takes engaged citizens. So let's stop thinking of ourselves as like, this is a problem that someone else can deal with. I'm not saying that you need to become a developer next week, but I'd say as a citizen, you can begin by connecting with your local organizations that are involved in housing, begin that conversation, begin finding solutions in your own community. And that's kind of how this stuff works. Diane, last.
I think you said it well, Ryan. It really takes community involvement. That's really what got us spurred into getting into development. And there are local partners. Like I said, there's 154 HRAs in the state, and there's other folks that work in housing too. So reach out, become involved. And I think that's very sage advice from Ryan.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Again, a huge thank you to Diane and Ryan for sharing their projects, their research, how you've built partnerships. And so watch for the follow-up email with the correct link for the evaluation. Thank you, everyone. Rick, I think we can stop